Hello friends, Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. Well, I recently had a request from someone who wanted me to shoot a video on my favorite things to ferment. Now, though some people have called me the fermenting queen, I don't think I've earned that title. I think that would be Stacy from Off Grid with Doug and Stacy. So if you want to see a lot of fermenting videos, though I have quite a bit, but if you want to see some on more items to ferment, I recommend that you check out their channel, which I will link in the description box down below, just in case you haven't heard of Off Grid with Doug and Stacy. And the reason I say that is because Stacy does like to ferment pretty much everything that she grows, where I have specific things I prefer to ferment, but not everything. So I'm going to be covering that today. I'm going to start off with juice. Now, when it comes to my own homegrown grapes, our grapes that we grow are all pretty much predominantly wine grapes, which means they're not the kind of grape, at least in our area, that are going to take on a good sweet flavor once they're ripe. And so they are best for using to make wine. Now, I have made juice out of them. It's a very tart juice. It's a great flavor, but it's very tart. So really the best thing to do with those grapes, even though I still have a lot of juice canned up that I'll use for making homemade gummies and things like that, really the best thing to do with our grapes is to make wine out of, and it does make an excellent wine. In fact, the wine that I made from our 2020 grapes is the best wine that I've made yet from our own homegrown grapes. In fact, I think it's the best wine that I've made ever. Probably the other one that would rival that is the one that I made with our own grapes, plus some wild picked blackberries from our area. I've also used just straight blackberries to make a wine, and that was pretty good. It makes it really, really dark. It kind of almost looks black, as you can see in this picture right here. But really, it tasted best when it was more of a half and half combined with our own grape juice and the wild picked blackberries. So about a 50-50. So really great wine. Now, if you don't drink and you'd like to know why would you want to make wine if you don't drink, I do have a video that I talk about all the many uses for homemade wine, even if you don't drink it. I use it quite a bit for many things. And then the other way I like to ferment juice, if it's more of a not so tart juice or one that you have to add a lot of sugar to, let's just say, for example, if you're like us and you live pretty remotely and you make that maybe 2-3 time a year trip into town to stock up on some certain supplies, well, we might swing by the store and buy like a big thing of juice just to have something to drink on the way home. And then whatever's left, I usually like to take that and ferment it. So it doesn't matter if it's orange juice, mango juice, whatever it is. And by the way, I have videos on all this stuff. I have the winemaking playlist, and then I have videos on how to make your own homemade natural sodas using whatever juice you have. It can be store-bought, it can be homegrown and pressed yourself. And so I make a natural soda out of that, and so it's very healthy and it's full of probiotics. Now, for me personally, all of the fermenting I do, except for vinegar, I use my homemade fermentation starter. I have a very in-depth video. That is the one I recommend, even though it's long. If I give you the short video, I'm going to get a ton of questions. So it's better if you're interested in that. You can make it out of anything. It's practically free to make and super easy. And that's what I prefer to use, but it's not the only way to ferment. There's the traditional brine method, which I used to do when I first started making kimchi. I did the traditional brine method with the cold fermentation process, which means you keep it in a cool area like a refrigerator, a root cellar, or something to ferment for 2 weeks. And I did that when I first started making kimchi. Now I use my fermentation starter to do that. And so I don't have to use as much salt either. And that's why I like my method. Now I have a video on that. It's called the no brine method of making kimchi. But anyway, so I'll link to the how to make your fermentation starter down below. And I use that in all of these things I'm mentioning. I use that starter to get my ferments going. And the nice thing about that is it reduces the amount of salt you need for anything that's a low acid food, like your cabbage, your hard-boiled eggs, your carrots, whatever it is that you like to ferment. And then for the fruit, obviously, it's going to taste better than using salt to ferment it. So now coming back to the fruit, the other thing I like to do a lot of fermenting of, this is something, and this is why I don't have a lot of physical items to show you, is a lot of these types of ferments are things I do in the summertime. And so when I've got some fresh fruits coming in, I like to use my fresh fruits for making a fermented fruit smoothies. And as you can see in this picture, I have a blueberry currant fermented smoothie, and that's from the fruits from my own garden, and I have a video just on that. I also have a video I did more recently this last fall when we got a bunch of the our neighbors' really ripe apples. They still had a good flavor, but they were just a little too ripe to just enjoy snacking on because they were kind of getting soft and a little punky. So I was making vinegar out of them and using them to make some fermented fruit smoothies that turned out so good. I'm definitely going to be doing that again this year, and I'll link to that video down below so you can see that I made 3 different flavors using some of my own homemade extracts and some other things. Again, it's so easy to do, and most of your ferments like that are going to be done in 3 days. Depending on the temperature of your home or where you're fermenting them, some can take up to 5 too, so that's just something to keep in mind. So now let's move on to the kimchi. Let's talk a little bit about that. Kimchi was the first fermented food that I ever started to make, and because I wanted to try kimchi for years, and I realized I was never going to get a chance to try it unless I just went ahead and made it myself. So I started looking recipes up online, and gosh, this was well, this was probably back when we first got internet, so back in the early 2000s for us, and I looked up various different recipes and kind of took bits and pieces out of each one, you know, looking at the traditional ways of making kimchi. And this was back before you just fermented everything for 3 days on your counter. But, you know, again, using the cold method ferment, which is the traditional way. And I just took my favorite elements out of all these different recipes and then took those and came up with my own recipe. That's what I started off with. And then when I came up with the fermentation starter idea, well, I didn't come up with it on my own. It really started off with the whole idea of using the ginger bug, which a lot of you have heard of. Then I realized that if fresh ginger is something that's hard for you to get or very expensive like it is around here, I found that you can use anything to make a fermentation starter. You can use dandelions or red clover. Like I have one I did a year ago that was dandelion red clover fermentation starter, just some wild herbs growing in the garden. You can use any kind of fruit that you have. You can use dried, freeze-dried, or fresh. Any of it will work to get a fermentation starter. So what I started doing was experimenting with that and then using that. I had already been making the mead for some time, and that's what got me into making a fermentation starter in the first place, was for making my own homemade mead. A plain regular mead is nothing but honey and water, and then whatever you use as a fermentation starter. So that was the second thing I ever started fermenting, was making my own homemade mead. But I've always made it with some kind of fruit added to it for flavor. And that was where I learned about the ginger bug, and then from there started experimenting, making my own different starters and using those in making the mead, and then started using it in things like the kimchi and fermenting many other things. I'm always experimenting. Now, the kimchi itself, I have my more traditional style kimchi that is going to involve cabbage, and you can use Napa cabbage, which is also known as Chinese cabbage, and bok choy. Both are really good, but I've actually found through the years, even though I used to always use bok choy and Napa cabbage in my original kimchi recipe, I have found just buying the lower cost regular green cabbage, or red, or both, is a lot less expensive if you're not already growing them. Get the organic ones at your store and still save money buying that over the non-organic bok choy and Chinese cabbage. So that with some onions, garlic, a little bit of carrots. That's my favorite. I do ferment carrots a little bit, but always when it's blended with something else, like in a kimchi. And then, of course, plenty of red pepper. Now, I do have that recipe on the kimchi. I'll link down below. But I also have a couple other videos you might be interested in on making kimchi, and one involves making a calendula kimchi, because one year I had so much calendula I couldn't even keep up on it. I had been drying tons and tons of calendula for using in my skin creams, but then had even more coming in, so I was adding it to tortillas, I was adding them to stir-fried vegetables, and then decided I'd try making kimchi out of it, and that was really good. And then another really good thing you can use to make kimchi out of in place of any kind of cabbage is nasturtium leaves and flowers. And so you can see in this picture right here, this is a nasturtium kimchi. And because nasturtiums already have that kind of brassica type flavor that tastes kind of like radishes, they make an excellent kimchi. They're the perfect flavor. The difference is they're not going to have as much crispness as your cabbages are. It's going to be a little softer, but still makes a really great kimchi. And then a couple other things I like to ferment that's not something I'm just going to eat straight out of the jar, are going to be things like onions. I started doing that. These are red onions. Fermented these quite a while back, and I've been into the jar. One thing you got to realize is once you start digging into your ferments, even if you're keeping them in the fridge, the color will change. They'll still stay good, especially in a cold storage of some kind for a long time, but it will change the color. So as soon as I opened up this jar and started using it, the color of these onions started changing. And then garlic. And then these are things that I ferment just to keep in more of a raw and ready to use form for using in stir fries and those kind of things. And I love doing that. It's just a great way to preserve the garlic and onions. No, you do not have to refrigerate it to keep them good, as long as they're fermented and you keep them closed. Once you open them though, it's still best keeping them in the fridge, and try to keep them, even if you're not going to refrigerate them while you've got them in storage, it's still best to keep them in the coolest place you can. And then right here is some horseradish. Now this isn't actually fermented, but this is horseradish from my garden. Now this has been sitting in my fridge for a couple years, still good, and nothing in there but vinegar and that. But if I'm going to do any more horseradish like this, I'm going to ferment it the same way I do my onions and garlic. One of the other things I really like to ferment, usually during the time of the year where my chickens are laying the most, they got the most eggs that they're putting out, are the hard-boiled eggs. So I have a couple of different videos. I have a short that I did on that, but then I have a more in-depth one I did as well. Super easy process. Again, it's just 3 days of fermenting using the fermentation starter and in your hard-boiled eggs, and then whatever seasonings that you want to add. It can be just salt, it can be red pepper, it can be onions and garlic and rosemary, whatever it is you want to put in there. I've tried it so many different ways. I've also used my own fermented beets, the beet kvass, to ferment eggs that way. I love the color. I love how the eggs turn out purple. And then a couple other ideas I've tried in the past, I haven't done in a while. If you like things like pickled green beans, for instance, or pickled green tomatoes, try fermenting them instead. I did the fermented green tomatoes quite a few years ago, and I did like them okay. So it was kind of like a fermented green tomato pickle, and I liked them okay. They weren't my favorite thing, but they weren't bad. And then another thing I did that I keep forgetting, and I hope to remember to do this year, were the fermented snow peas. I tried that one year, and those turned out really good. Something good for just snacking on. So if you like having some fermented foods on hand, and you've got a lot of things like snow peas or green tomatoes, that's something you can try, and just to see if you like it. And if nothing else, you can even still take those and cook them up. If you don't like eating them raw, you don't like the flavor of them, any of your fermented foods, once you cook them up, they kind of lose that fermented flavor, but they're also going to lose their probiotics if you're going to cook them up. So just keep that in mind. I have people that sometimes ask, well, can I can my fermented this and that? Well, then what was the point of fermenting it for preservation if you're going to can it anyway? Personally, I'm not going to go through the trouble. If I'm going to can my carrots anyway, I'm not going to go through the trouble of fermenting them first, because that's just pointless. Fermenting is a form of preservation. So, and if you're wanting to keep the probiotics, don't can it, because that'll kill all that, and you're gonna lose that. And then the same goes with anything if you decide to cook with it like I do with these. This is just a way for me to preserve it. It's not necessarily a way for me to concern myself with getting the probiotics, because I don't plan on eating these raw. They're just ready to use to cook into foods, especially, like I said, stir fries. But if it's something you're wanting to eat for the sake of the probiotics, no, you don't want to cook it. You want to eat it raw. But as I was starting to say, if you don't like the flavor of it fermented and raw, then yes, you can go ahead and cook it into some other dishes, and you won't have to worry about that flavor. While you'll lose your probiotics, you'll still get the benefits of those vegetables into whatever you've got, and that was just a great way for you to have preserved them. Because I could have done the same thing with those snow peas if I decided I didn't like them fermented like that and just eating them straight out of the jar. I could have went ahead and just thrown them into stir fries and used them that way, like I do the ones from the freezer. Okay, so those are all my favorite things to ferment, plus a few other things that I'll do on occasion, or I've tried at least once. And so I hope that gives you some ideas. Really, you can ferment anything that you want, fruit, vegetable, or whatever. And it's actually a pretty easy process, and there's a few different ways that you can ferment. There's not that one way that's necessarily more right than the other. It's just what's easiest and best for you personally. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and don't forget to check out my links I'll be putting down below on other videos on how I ferment this and how I make that, so you can see how I do it personally and compare it to maybe other people's videos and how they might like to use the brine method, and so on and so forth. All right, well, thanks for watching. Take care, and God bless.